In 1990, a geologist stood at the base of the Great Sphinx and noticed something the Egyptologists had missed for decades. The weathering patterns carved into the limestone walls of the enclosure were not the work of wind and sand. They were the unmistakable signature of water, heavy, sustained rainfall, the kind that hasn't fallen on the Giza Plateau for more than 7,000 years. The Sphinx, according to every textbook, every museum placard, every accepted timeline of Egyptian history, was carved around 2500 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Khafra. But the geology tells a different story, a story written in stone by water that should not have been there, by erosion that requires thousands of years of rainfall to create, by evidence that suggests someone was carving monuments on the Giza Plateau when Egypt was still green, when the Sahara was still savanna, when human civilization was not supposed to exist. Yet here's what makes this even more remarkable. Beneath the plateau, modern scanning technology has revealed something that mainstream archaeology has struggled to explain: vast underground chambers, vertical shafts descending hundreds of feet into bedrock, geometric passages connecting multiple levels, a subterranean network that extends far beyond the known chambers of the pyramids. Some researchers estimate these installations could predate the first pharaoh by thousands of years. The question is not whether they exist. The radar data confirms they're there. The question is who built them and what the Egyptians were actually constructing their civilization on top of. The ancient Sumerian texts written in cuneiform on clay tablets more than 5,000 years ago describe beings they called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Mainstream scholars interpret these as mythological deities, but the texts describe them with remarkable specificity. Physical beings who arrived, who established settlements, who built underground installations to protect themselves from surface conditions, who performed what the texts call genetic experiments. And according to these same texts, one of their primary centers of operation was in the land they called Tamari, the beloved land, what we now call Egypt. So tonight, as the day fades and your thoughts begin to slow, I'm going to take you on a journey beneath the sounds of Giza. Not just to explore what might be there, but to ask a question that archaeology has been reluctant to confront. What if the monuments we attribute to the pharaohs were not built from nothing, but constructed on top of something far older? What if ancient Egypt inherited an infrastructure it did not fully understand, incorporating mysterious passages and chambers left by whoever came before? What if the timeline of civilization is not what we've been told, and the evidence of an earlier chapter has been buried both literally and figuratively beneath layers of sand and orthodoxy? Close your eyes if you'd like. You won't need visuals for this journey. The world I'm building exists better in shadow, in the space between memory and history, in the quiet places where conventional narratives begin to unravel. Let the story unfold at its own pace. Let your breathing slow, and let's descend together into the layered history of Giza, where every answer seems to reveal another deeper question. Before we go deeper, if this resonates with you, a quiet like helps others find these stories. I'm curious, where in the world are you drifting off from tonight? What time is it there? And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Let the ancient world emerge in your mind's eye. Thank you for always having our back. The sand whispers secrets at Giza. It always has, but for most of recorded history, we have refused to listen. Stand at the edge of the Sphinx enclosure and look down into that massive trench carved from living bedrock. The walls of this ancient quarry are not smooth. They are deeply weathered, carved by forces that official Egyptology has struggled to explain for decades. The erosion patterns are vertical, rounded, flowing. They look unmistakably like the work of water, not windblown sand, which creates horizontal striations, sharp and abrasive, not the slow chemical weathering of desert conditions, but heavy, sustained rainfall, the kind of precipitation that carved gullies and channels into soft limestone over centuries of exposure. The problem is simple and devastating. Egypt has been an arid desert for the last 5,000 years. The Sphinx, according to mainstream archaeology, was carved around 2500 BCE, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty. But the climate data is clear. By that time, the African humid period had long since ended. The Sahara was already a desert. The Nile Valley received perhaps an inch or two of rainfall per year, nowhere near enough to create the kind of deep water erosion visible on the Sphinx and its enclosure walls. In 1990, a geologist named Robert Schoch traveled to Egypt with a simple mission. He was accompanying an alternative researcher named John Anthony West, who had long argued that the Sphinx was far older than conventional dating suggested. West wanted a trained geologist to examine the monument and provide a scientific assessment. Schoch agreed, expecting to confirm the standard timeline and put the matter to rest. He was a respected academic with a doctorate from Yale. He believed in evidence, in the scientific method, in peer review. What he found changed everything. Schoch spent weeks at the site examining every inch of the Sphinx enclosure, comparing the weathering patterns to other structures on the Giza Plateau that were unquestionably from the 4th dynasty. The difference was stark. The mastaba tombs, the subsidiary pyramids, all the structures that archaeologists could definitively date. Khafre's era showed only wind erosion, the characteristic desert weathering of 5,000 years of sandblasting, but the Sphinx and its enclosure walls told a different story, a story written in water. After careful analysis, Schoch made a claim that would make him a pariah in mainstream Egyptology and a hero to alternative researchers. The Sphinx, he concluded, had to have been carved during a much wetter period in Egypt's climate history, not 2500 BCE, but at least 7,000 years earlier, perhaps as far back as 9,500 BCE, or even earlier to the end of the last ice age, when North Africa was still green and lush, when seasonal rains still fell on the Sahara, when the climate was wet enough to support the kind of sustained precipitation that could carve those deep channels into limestone over millennia. If Schoch was right, the implications were staggering. The Sphinx would predate the first pharaoh by thousands of years. It would predate the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. It would predate the invention of writing, the development of agriculture in the Nile Valley, the entire foundation of Egyptian civilization as we understand it. The Sphinx would have been built not by the Egyptians at all, but by someone else, some earlier culture, some forgotten civilization that possessed the organizational capability, the technical knowledge, and the sheer ambition to carve a massive monument from bedrock and then maintain it through enough centuries of rainfall to leave those telltale marks of water erosion. The academic establishment reacted with predictable fury. Egyptologists lined up to denounce Schoch. They argued that he had misinterpreted the weathering patterns, that groundwater seepage could explain the erosion, that wind and sand over 5,000 years could create vertical channels, that any number of geological processes could account for what looked like rain damage without requiring a radical redating of one of Egypt's most iconic monuments. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's most famous archaeologist and then the guardian of antiquities, dismissed the theory as pseudoscience, fantasy, and insult to serious scholarship. But Schoch's geological credentials were impeccable. He was not an amateur with a fringe theory. He was a trained scientist presenting empirical observations. The weathering patterns were real. The climate data was undeniable. Something had carved those deep-flowing channels into the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, and wind-blown sand was not a convincing culprit. The debate has raged for more than 3 decades now, and it shows no signs of resolution. But what it has done, what Schoch's controversial claim has accomplished, is force us to consider a possibility that makes conventional historians deeply uncomfortable. What if there was a sophisticated culture in the Nile Valley long before dynastic Egypt? What if the monuments we attribute to the pharaohs were not built from scratch, but constructed on top of, around, and incorporating far older structures? What if the Egyptians were not the original architects of Giza, but the inheritors of a legacy they themselves did not fully understand? This is not speculation for speculation's sake. This is a question with physical evidence demanding answers. Because the Sphinx is not the only anomaly at Giza. It is simply the most visible. Beneath the plateau, hidden from casual view, there is another world entirely, a world of shafts and tunnels, chambers and passages, subterranean structures that the ancient Egyptians knew about, incorporated into their temples and tombs, but did not build. Structures that were already ancient when the first pharaoh placed his crown on his head. In recent years, advanced scanning technologies have revealed something extraordinary beneath the Giza Plateau. Synthetic aperture radar, ground-penetrating radar, seismic surveys, electrical resistivity tomography. Modern science has given us eyes that can see through stone and sand, that can map what lies hidden in the earth without ever breaking ground. And what these technologies have shown us is that geyser is not solid bedrock beneath a layer of monuments. Geyser is honeycombed, riddled with voids, a complex network of underground spaces that extends far beyond the known chambers of the pyramids. Italian and Scottish research teams have published data suggesting the existence of massive subterranean chambers beneath the Great Pyramid and Khafra's Pyramid. Not small cavities, not natural fissures in the limestone, but precisely engineered spaces measuring tens of meters across. Vertical shafts descending hundreds of feet into the bedrock, spiral pathways, geometric passages connecting multiple levels, a layout that does not match anything built by 4th dynasty Egyptians, whose architectural style and capabilities are well documented from other sites. The official response has been silence or dismissal. Egyptian authorities have blocked excavation permits. Mainstream archaeologists have called the radar findings inconclusive, artifacts of the scanning technology, misinterpretations of natural geological features. But the researchers stand by their data. The anomalies are real. The underground structures exist. One structure we know for certain is real because it has been physically excavated is the Osiris shaft. Located near the causeway of Khafra's pyramid, this vertical shaft descends more than 100 ft through solid limestone to a series of chambers at different levels. At the bottom, 35 meter down, there is a room containing a massive granite sarcophagus surrounded by an artificial water channel. The entire chamber is designed to flood when connected to the underground aquifer, creating an island in the middle of subterranean water, a physical manifestation of the Egyptian myth of the primordial mound emerging from the waters of chaos. But here's the question that official archaeology cannot adequately answer. Who built the Osiris shaft? The granite sarcophagus and the religious symbolism are clearly Egyptian, dating to the late period around the 7th or 6th century BCE. But the shaft itself, the cutting through solid limestone, the precision of the excavation, the hydraulic engineering required to control the water flow from the aquifer, all of this suggests a level of sophistication that seems extraordinary even for late-period Egypt. And some researchers have noted that the shaft appears to incorporate older structures that the Egyptians may have been excavating into and modifying a pre-existing underground complex rather than creating something entirely new. Sediment analysis from radar scans of the surrounding area shows signs of water erosion and mineral deposits tied to Nile flooding events that occurred before Egypt's first dynasty. If this dating is accurate, it means parts of the subterranean network at Giza, or at least the geological evidence of water interaction with carved stone, predate 3100 BCE. The Osiris shaft is not alone. Historical records from explorers in the 1800s describe strange wells and sealed passages near the Sphinx. French archaeologist Pierre-Jean Marotte mapped anomalies in the area in the 1860s and the 1880s. Between 1929 and 39, prominent scholars George Rinner, Hermann Juncker, and Selim Hassan traced a line of cavities between the Sphinx and Khafra's pyramid. After their investigations, the area was largely forgotten, or perhaps deliberately left alone. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described something even more extraordinary. He claimed that beneath the pyramids of Giza, there was a vast labyrinth containing 3,000 chambers, many of them hidden underground, including a large subterranean pyramid. He wrote that Egyptian priests told him the foundation of the plateau had been deliberately engineered, that chambers were made on the hill where the pyramids stand, intended as burial places for the original rulers and supplied with water by a channel brought in from the Nile. He described underground passages, an island in the middle of subterranean water where a king was buried. For centuries, Herodotus's account was dismissed as myth, the kind of exaggerated tale ancient travelers loved to tell. But the discovery of the Osiris shaft with its island sarcophagus and water channels suggests that Herodotus may have been describing something real, something he had been told about by Egyptian priests who still remembered even in his time 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, that there was a hidden world beneath Giza, a world that predated the pharaohs. This brings us to the most controversial question of all. If there is an older layer at Giza, a subterranean infrastructure that the Egyptians built upon but did not originate, who created it? The conventional answer for those willing to entertain the possibility of pre-dynastic structures at all is that there must have been an earlier unidentified human culture in the Nile Valley, a sophisticated group who developed monumental architecture before the rise of dynastic Egypt and then vanished, leaving only their underground works, behind which the later Egyptians incorporated into their own religious and burial complexes. But there is another answer. An answer that comes not from Egypt, but from ancient Mesopotamia, from the clay tablets of Sumer, from texts written in cuneiform that tell a story the academic world has long dismissed as mythology, but that alternative receives, researchers insist, is history. A story of beings who came from the sky, who possessed advanced technology, who created humanity as a workforce, and who built their first settlements not on the surface, but deep underground in carefully engineered chambers and tunnels designed to protect them from the harsh conditions of an alien world. The Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. If we are going to explore the possibility that ancient Egypt was built on top of an older civilization, we must first understand who the Anunnaki were supposed to be, what the ancient texts actually say about them, and why the theory of their involvement in human history has become one of the most persistent and controversial ideas in alternative archaeology. The name Anunnaki comes from ancient Sumerian texts, the oldest written records of human civilization, dating back more than 5,000 years to the cities of southern Mesopotamia in what is now Iraq. Sumer was the birthplace of writing, of complex urban society, of organized religion and centralized government. And in the myths and legends of Sumer, preserved on thousands of clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped cuneiform script, the Anunnaki appear again and again as the principal deities, the gods who ruled over heaven and earth. In mainstream academic understanding, the Anunnaki are simply the Sumerian pantheon, divine beings, personifications of natural forces, mythological ths, of figures whose stories served religious, political, and cultural functions for the people who worship them. They are no more real than Zeus or Odin, Thor or Shiva. They are humanity's ancient attempt to explain the world, to give meaning to existence, to create narratives of power and morality. But in Tatsui's, a man named Zaya Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet that would change how millions of people understood these ancient gods. Sitchin was not a trained archaeologist or a professional linguist, though he was fluent in modern and ancient Hebrew and had studied cuneiform. He was an independent researcher with a radical idea. What if the Sumerian myths were not myths at all? What if they were historical accounts, literal descriptions of real events involving extraterrestrial visitors? Sitchin's theory was audacious. He claimed that the Anunnaki were an advanced alien race from a planet called Nibiru, a world on a vast elliptical orbit that brings it into the inner solar system once every 3,600 years. According to his translation of ancient texts, Nibiru was dying. Its atmosphere was eroding. The only solution was to suspend fine gold particles in the stratosphere to reflect heat and light, creating an artificial shield. But Nibiru was pouring gold. So the Anunnaki launched an expedition to Earth, a planet they knew was rich in the precious metal. They arrived, Sitchin claimed, approximately 450,000 years ago. They established bases in Mesopotamia and began mining operations, primarily in southeastern Africa. For thousands of years, the Anunnaki toiled in these mines. But eventually, the workers rebelled. The labor was too hard, too dangerous. A crisis emerged. The mining operation was essential to saving their home world, but the workforce was on the verge of collapse. This is when, according to Sitchin's interpretation of the Sumerian creation myths, the Anunnaki chief scientist, a being named Enki, proposed a solution. They would create a new species, a hybrid being that combined the DNA of the Anunnaki with that of a primitive hominid already evolving on Earth. This new creature would be intelligent enough to follow complex instructions and operate mining equipment, but not so intelligent that it would question its purpose. It would be in essence a biological tool, a slave species. The being they created was called the Adarpa, the model man, the prototype. In later religious traditions, distorted through thousands of years of oral transmission and cultural evolution, this story would become the biblical account of Adam, the first man created in the image of God. Sitchin's theory is rejected by virtually every mainstream scholar who has examined it. His translations of cuneiform have been called inaccurate. His interpretations of ancient myths labeled as cherry-picked and taken wildly out of context. His understanding of Mesopotamian culture dismissed as fundamentally flawed. Experts in Sumerian language point out that Anunnaki simply means princely offspring, or those of royal blood, a reference to their status as the children of the sky god Anu. There is no ancient text, they insist, that explicitly describes the Anunnaki as space travelers or genetic engineers, and yet Sitchin's books have sold millions of copies worldwide. His ideas have become foundational to the ancient astronaut theory, a hypothesis that proposes extraterrestrial influence on early human civilization. His work has inspired television shows, documentaries, and an entire subculture of researchers who believe that the conventional account of human origins is incomplete, that we are not the product of random mutation and natural selection alone, but the deliberate creation of technologically advanced beings who saw our planet as a resource to be exploited. Whether Sitchin was right or wrong in the specifics, what his work accomplished was to force us to look at ancient texts with fresh eyes, to ask uncomfortable questions about the sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge in cultures that supposedly had no writing, no mathematics, no concept of the cosmos, just a few centuries before they were building ziggurats and charting the movements of planets. The Sumerians knew things they should not have been able to know. They had a base 60 mathematical system, a sexismal framework we still use today when we divide the hour into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds, the circle into 360 degrees. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, a 25,120-year cycle caused by the slow wobble of Earth's axis, a phenomenon that would require centuries of precise astronomical observation to detect. They could predict lunar eclipses. They had detailed star catalogues. They describe planets that are not visible to the naked eye. How did a Bronze Age culture achieve this level of astronomical sophistication? The conventional answer is that they were brilliant, patient observers who accumulated knowledge over many generations. But alternative researchers point out that the Sumerian texts themselves offer a different explanation. They say repeatedly and explicitly that this knowledge was given to them by the Anunnaki, the gods who came from the sky and taught humanity the arts of civilization. Now, whether those gods were extraterrestrials, as Sitchin claimed, or representatives of an earlier, now lost human civilization, as other researchers suggest, or simply mythological figures, as mainstream scholars insist, the pattern remains the same. Ancient cultures around the world describe a time when knowledge was transferred from someone else, some older and wiser source, to primitive humanity. The Egyptians credited the god Thoth with bringing writing and science. The Mayans spoke of Kulkan, the feathered serpent who descended from the sky to teach them astronomy and agriculture. The Greeks told of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods to give to mankind. These are not isolated myths. They're a global pattern, a recurring theme that appears in almost every ancient culture. The sudden gift of civilization, the transfer of knowledge from an advanced source to a primitive people, the memory preserved in story that we did not invent everything ourselves, that we were taught, that there were teachers. And if those teachers existed, if there truly was a transfer of technology and knowledge at the dawn of civilization, then where did they come from? Where did they go? And what did they leave behind? This is where the story returns to Egypt. Because if the Anunnaki or some equivalent precursor civilization existed, if they built underground structures before the rise of dynastic Egypt, then Giza would have been the perfect place to do it. Central location in the Nile Valley, solid limestone bedrock, ideal for excavation, high ground above the floodplain of the river, strategic position at the border between Upper and Lower Egypt, and most intriguingly, direct access to the underground aquifer, the water table that made hydraulic engineering possible thousands of years before the invention of modern pumps. The Egyptians themselves left tantalizing hints that they were building on top of something older. The pyramid texts carved into the walls of the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties contain passages that do not describe the afterlife journey of a pharaoh, but seem to reference much older events, a time before the dynasties, before the kings, before the unification of Egypt itself. They speak of the first time, the Zepi and Golden Age, when the gods walked the earth, when the land was different, when great works were accomplished by beings who were not human. The Edfu building texts preserved at the Pearl Temple of Horus in Upper Egypt tell an even more explicit story. They describe a group of divine beings called the Shebu, the 7 sages who came to Egypt in the distant past and built the first temples. These structures, the texts say, were constructed according to a plan laid down in the time before time, a sacred geometry designed to encode the knowledge of the cosmos. And crucially, these first temples were built on mounds that emerged from the primordial waters, islands of dry land that rose from the flood. Does this sound familiar? It should, because it is exactly what archaeologists found at the bottom of the Osiris shaft, a chamber designed to flood with a granite sarcophagus on a raised platform, an artificial island surrounded by water, a physical recreation of the mythological primordial mound. The Egyptians were not just preserving a story, they were building monuments that incorporated the physical reality of much older structures. They were thus quite literally constructing their civilization on top of the foundations left by whoever came before. And the evidence for this layering is not limited to mythology and underground shafts. In 2024, researchers using ground-penetrating radar announced the discovery of 2 large underground structures near the Great Pyramid in an area of the Western Cemetery that had never been excavated. The structures are L-shaped, buried about 6 and 1/2 ft below the surface. One appears to be empty or filled with sand and gravel. The others show signs of worked stone, carved passages, internal chambers. The researchers noted that the L shape cannot be created by natural geological processes. These are artificial structures, but they do not match any known 4th dynasty architecture. They are something else, something older perhaps, or something built by the Egyptians using older foundations they discovered when they began construction on the Giza Plateau. In late 2024 and early 2025, new reports emerged from Italian and Scottish teams claiming to have detected using synthetic aperture radar tomography, a vast underground complex beneath all 3 major pyramids. The data suggests 8 vertical cylindrical shafts, each descending more than 2,000 ft into the bedrock. Spiral staircases surrounding the shafts, 2 massive cubic chambers, each approximately 80 meters on a side, 5 multi-level structures connected by geometric passageways. If confirmed, this would represent the largest underground construction project in ancient history, a subterranean city that dwarfs anything the Egyptians are known to have built. Egyptian authorities have dismissed these claims as fantasy, as misinterpretation of radar data, as pseudoscience promoted by fringe researchers with no understanding of archaeology. They have refused to grant excavation permits. They have blocked further investigation. The official position is that Giza has been thoroughly studied, that there are no hidden chambers of significance, that any underground spaces are either known structures like the Osiris shaft or natural voids in the limestone that have no archaeological importance. But the refusal to investigate is itself suspicious. If the radar data is wrong, if the anomalies are just natural features or artifacts of the scanning technology, then excavation would prove that conclusively. The fact that authorities are blocking excavation suggests they either believe there might be something there and do not want it found, or they are operating under a policy that protects the established narrative even at the cost of potential new discoveries. The conspiracy theories that swirl around this situation are predictable and in some cases justified by the circumstances. If there is a vast underground complex beneath Giza, and if it predates dynastic Egypt, then its discovery would force a complete rewrite of ancient history. It would mean that the pharaohs were not the original builders of the plateau. It would mean that the pyramids themselves might be constructions built on top of or incorporating far older foundations. It would mean that the sudden appearance of Egyptian civilization, that mysterious leap from scattered Neolithic villages to one of the most sophisticated societies in the ancient world in the space of just a few centuries, was not a natural development, but the result of inheriting an already advanced infrastructure. And if that infrastructure was built by the Anunnaki or by any other non-human or pre-human civilization, then the implications extend far beyond archaeology. They touch on the fundamental question of who we are, where we came from, and whether we are truly alone in the universe. The Egypt and Uni connection, for those who believe in it, is supported by more than just the physical anomalies at Giza. It is supported by a network of linguistic, cultural, and mythological parallels between ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia. Connections that mainstream scholars acknowledge but interpret very differently than alternative researchers. The most important Egyptian cult center located at Heliopolis in Lower Egypt was called Anu by the ancient Egyptians. This name is startlingly similar to Anu, the name of the supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon, the father of the Anunnaki, the ruler of the heavens. Is this a coincidence, a linguistic accident, or evidence of a shared origin? A memory of the same divine beings worshipped under slightly different names by two cultures separated by 1,000 miles of desert. The Egyptian texts speak of the Anu people, described as the gods of the earth, the first inhabitants of the Nile Valley. Alternative researchers interpret this as a reference to the Anunnaki themselves, or their human Anunnaki hybrid offspring, who settled in Egypt after the Great Flood and established the foundations of what would become pharaonic civilization. Mainstream scholars insist the Anu people were simply the indigenous inhabitants of the Heliopolis region, that the name has no connection to the Sumerian Anu, that the similarity is coincidental. But the parallels do not stop with names. The mythologies of Egypt and Sumer share deep structural similarities. Both cultures describe a pantheon of gods who are not abstract spiritual entities, but beings with physical bodies, with families, with conflicts and alliances that shape the world. Both describe a time when these gods walked among humans, when they ruled directly over cities and kingdoms, when they performed mighty works of construction and engineering. Both describe the catastrophic flood that destroyed the world and forced the gods to intervene to save a remnant of humanity. The Egyptian god Ptah worshipped as the creator deity. The master craftsman who spoke the world into existence through divine words is remarkably similar to the Sumerian god Enki, who was also a creator, a scientist, a technologist, the one who genetically engineered humanity and who repeatedly intervened to save humans from the wrath of his brother Enlil. Some researchers identify Ptah and Enki as the same being worshipped under different names by different cultures who had both been in contact with him. The Egyptian god Thi, depicted as an ibis-headed figure, was the god of writing, magic, science, and wisdom. He was said to have come from a distant land bringing knowledge that elevated humanity from barbarism to civilization. He was credited with designing the pyramids, with measuring the earth, with recording the secrets of the cosmos. In Sumerian mythology, there is a similar figure, the god Ningish-Zida, also associated with wisdom and secret knowledge, also depicted with serpent symbolism that links him to the deeper mysteries of existence. Some researchers identify Thoth with Ningish-Zida, or with the Samrian Nabu, the scribe of the gods. The Egyptian goddess Isis, wife of Osiris and mother of Horus, bears striking similarities to the Samrian goddess Inanna, also known as Ishtar in the Akkadian language. Both are powerful female deities associated with love, war, fertility, and the planet Venus. Both have myths involving descent into the underworld and triumphant return. Both are depicted as queens of heaven, rulers of the stars, beings of immense power who could challenge even the highest gods. The Egyptian god Set, the murderer of Osiris, the embodiment of chaos and disorder. The desert god who represents everything wild and untamed is often compared to the Sumerian Nergal, god of the underworld, war, and pestilence. Another deity associated with destruction and the breaking of cosmic order. These parallels have been known to scholars for more than a century. The conventional explanation is cultural diffusion, the spread of ideas and stories through trade, migration, and conquest. Ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt were not isolated civilizations. They traded extensively. They fought wars. They knew about each other. It is entirely possible, indeed likely, that religious ideas and mythological motifs traveled along the same routes as goods and people that the Egyptians borrowed from the Samrians, or vice versa, that both borrowed from even earlier cultures now lost to history. But alternative researchers ask a different question. What if the parallels are not due to borrowing, but to a shared source? What if both the Egyptians and the Samrians were describing the same beings, the same gods, the same historical events, just using the names and cultural frameworks of their own societies? What if the Anunnaki were real, and they operated in both Mesopotamia and Egypt, leaving behind not just myths, but physical structures, underground installations that both cultures built upon and incorporated into their own religious complexes? This theory gained support from a curious detail that has long puzzled archaeologists. The sudden appearance of advanced civilization in Egypt around 3100 BCE was not a purely indigenous development. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, when it first appears, is already fully formed, a complex system capable of expressing abstract concepts, recording history, encoding religious texts. There is no slow evolution from primitive pictographs to sophisticated writing. It appears suddenly as if someone already knew how to write and simply began doing so. Similarly, the astronomical and mathematical knowledge that underpinned Egyptian architecture, The ability to align pyramids to true north with astonishing precision, the understanding of pi and the golden ratio, the knowledge of the Earth's circumference, and the relationship between the Earth and the Moon. All of this appears without any evidence of the trial and error process you would expect from a culture developing these concepts for the first time. The mainstream explanation is that we are missing the earlier developmental stages, that the evidence has been lost due to the perishable nature of papyrus and wood, that the slow evolution of Egyptian culture occurred but has not been preserved in the archaeological record. And this is certainly possible. The Nile's annual flooding would have destroyed countless settlements and artifacts over the millennia. But it is also possible that the knowledge was not developed in Egypt at all. It was imported either from Mesopotamia, where we know writing and mathematics appeared earlier, or from an even older source, a precursor civilization that taught both the Sumerians and the Egyptians and then vanished, leaving only its underground installations and its mythological legacy. If that precursor civilization was the Anunnaki, then we must ask what happened to them. Where did they go? The Sumerian texts provide an answer, though interpreting it requires accepting their accounts as history rather than myth. According to the Epic of Gilgamesh and other Mesopotamian texts, the Anunnaki ruled Earth directly for thousands of years. They established cities, taught humanity the arts of civilization, and used human labor to mine the resources they needed. But their presence was not permanent. The texts describe a great conflict, wars between factions of the Anunnaki, devastating weapons that could level mountains and boil the seas, cataclysms that reshaped the world. The most famous of these events is the Great Flood described in the story of Utnapishtim-Gilgamesh in the Sumerian tale of Zeus Sudra in the Akkadian Atrahasis epic. The flood, the texts say, was not a natural disaster. It was a deliberate act by the Anunnaki leader Enlil, who had grown tired of humanity's noise and chaos and decided to wipe the species out entirely. But his brother Enki, who had created humanity and felt a paternal responsibility for his creatures, defied the decision and warned a human named Utnapishtim to build a boat and save himself, his family, and the seed of all living things. After the flood, the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity changed. The gods withdrew from tetractical rule. They established human kingship, appointing mortal rulers who would govern on their behalf. They moved from overt presence to covert influence, from physical cities on Earth's surface to hidden installations, to underground bases, to orbital stations, and eventually, according to some interpretations of the texts, back to their home world of Nibiru. The last recorded interaction between the Anunnaki and humanity, according to Sitchin's chronology, occurred around 1600 BCE, when a nuclear war between Anunnaki factions destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and ended Sumerian civilization. After that, the gods fell silent. They became memory, legend, myth. But if they built extensive underground installations, if they established bases deep beneath the deserts of Egypt and Iraq, then those structures would still exist, sealed, perhaps hidden, forgotten but not destroyed, waiting beneath the sands for someone to rediscover them. And if the Egyptians built their civilization on top of these installations, if they incorporated the ancient tunnels and chambers into their own temples and tombs, if they preserved in their mythology the memory of the first time when the gods walked the earth, then Giza becomes not the origin of Egyptian civilization, but the site of its greatest inheritance, the plateau where the old world and the new world meet, the place where human ambition built upon inhuman foundations, this layering of civilizations, this idea that the past is not a single continuous thread, but a series of rises and falls of advanced cultures appearing and vanishing of knowledge gained and lost and rediscovered, is deeply unsettling to conventional history. We want to believe in progress, in the steady march from primitive to sophisticated, from cave paintings to computers. We want to believe that we are the pinnacle of human achievement, that nothing before us was as advanced as we are now. But the evidence, both physical and text, suggests otherwise. The precision of the Great Pyramid's construction, the sophistication of its internal passages and chambers, the alignment to celestial bodies with an accuracy that modern engineers struggle to match using computer-aided design. All of this points to a level of knowledge that seems incongruous with a Bronze Age culture that had only recently invented writing. The official explanation is that the Egyptians were simply much better engineers than we give them credit for, that they developed techniques we have not yet rediscovered, that their methods were lost when their civilization declined and were never properly recorded. And this may be true, but it requires us to believe that they achieved this level of precision using copper tools, wooden sledges, and no knowledge of the wheel or the pulley, devices we consider fundamental to any advanced construction. The alternative explanation is that they did not build the pyramids from scratch. They built them on top of existing foundations, using pre-existing shafts and passages, incorporating underground structures that were already there when the first dynasty began. They were extraordinarily skilled architects and builders, yes, but they were working with a template, a plan laid out by someone else, perhaps thousands of years earlier. This is not to diminish the achievements of the Egyptians. They accomplished extraordinary things. They ruled the Nile Valley for 3,000 years, longer than any other continuous civilization in human history. They developed mathematics, medicine, literature, art. They created a culture so rich and enduring that its influence can still be felt today. But they may also have been the inheritors of something even greater, the heirs to a lost civilization, the custodians of ancient knowledge they preserved even as they forgot where it came from. Consider the mystery of the Benben stone. According to Egyptian tradition, the very first sacred object, the prototype for the pyramidion that capped every pyramid and obelisk, was the Benben stone that sat atop the primordial mound at Heliopolis. This stone, the texts say, came aboard the boat of Ra, the sun god, in the earliest days of creation. It was not made by human hands. It descended from the sky. This sounds like mythology, but what if it is describing a real object, a stone or metallic artifact that arrived from the sky that was placed on the primordial mound by the gods, and that became the sacred prototype for all later Egyptian architecture? What if the pyramid shape itself is not a human invention, but an attempt to recreate the form of this original sky stone? The word pyramid does not come from Egyptian, comes from Greek pyramis, which might derive from the Egyptian poma, meaning that which goes up to heaven. The Egyptians themselves called these structures mister, which can be translated as place of ascension or place of transformation, not tombs, not monuments to ego, but functional structures with a specific purpose, a purpose that may have been related to the original purpose of the underground installations on which they were built. Some researchers have proposed that the pyramids were not tombs at all, but power plants, machines designed to harness geothermal energy or to focus electromagnetic radiation, to transmit power wirelessly or to communicate across vast distances. These theories, dismissed as fringe pseudoscience by mainstream Egyptology, gain circumstantial support from some curious facts. The Great Pyramid is built directly over a natural underground water source, the aquifer that feeds the Nile. Water flowing through fissures in the bedrock would create piezoelectric effects in the quartz containing limestone, generating small electrical charges. The shafts that run from the king's and queen's chambers, long assumed to be air shafts for ventilation, have been shown to align with specific stars, suggesting a more complex function than simple airflow. The sarcophagus in the king's chamber is not a coffin. It was carved from a single block of granite, material chosen not for its beauty but for its acoustic properties. When struck, it resonates at a specific frequency. The chamber itself, built entirely of granite blocks, is designed like a resonance chamber, a space where sound and vibration could be amplified. What was it amplifying? What purpose did this serve? If we are willing to entertain the possibility, just for a moment, that the pyramids were built on top of much older structures, that the elaborate internal passages and chambers were designed not just for burial, but for some other function, then many of the mysteries surrounding these monuments begin to make more sense. The precision becomes necessary rather than excessive. The materials become chosen for their properties rather than their appearance. The alignments become functional rather than symbolic. And beneath it all, deep underground, hidden in the sealed shafts and chambers that radar suggests are there, might be the original installations, the Anunnaki complex, the infrastructure they built when they first arrived 450,000 years ago to begin their mining operations and genetic experiments. A network of tunnels and chambers designed not for humans, but for beings with different needs, different physiology, different technology. The Osiris shaft with its flooded chamber and island sarcophagus might have been a water management system, a way to control the underground aquifer and use it for cooling or hydraulics or chemical processing. The vertical shafts descending hundreds of feet into bedrock might have been elevation systems for underground facilities that extended far deeper than anyone has yet excavated. The massive cubic chambers suggested by radar, each 80 meters on a side, would be large enough to house industrial equipment, genetic laboratories, storage facilities, living quarters for a substantial population of Anunnaki and their human workers. If such chambers exist, if excavation were permitted and confirmed their presence, it would be the archaeological discovery of the millennium. It would prove that Giza is not what we thought it was, not an acropolis built by pharaohs for pharaohs, but a site that has been continuously occupied and modified for thousands of years, with layers of construction and use extending far beyond the Fourth Dynasty, down into the pre-dynastic period, down into the Neolithic, down perhaps to the end of the Ice Age itself. The water erosion on the Sphinx would not be an anomaly requiring explanation. It would be expected because the Sphinx would have been carved when Egypt was still wet, when the Sahara was still savanna, when the climate was fundamentally different than it is now. The Sphinx would have been one of the surface markers for the underground complex, a guardian at the entrance, a symbol visible for miles across the ancient landscape, a signal to those who knew what to look for, that this place was important, that something significant lay beneath. Why a sphinx? Why a creature with a lion's body and a human head? Alternative researchers note that in the geological age when Shock dates the carving of the Sphinx around 10 through 500 BCE, The constellation Leo would have risen directly in front of the monument at the spring equinox, the moment of sunrise on the day when day and night are equal length. The Sphinx would have been gazing at its celestial counterpart, a lion in the sky watching a lion on the ground. This astronomical alignment is too precise to be coincidental. But more than that, the lion is a solar symbol, an animal of power and kingship, and the human head, according to some researchers, was not the original. If you look at the Sphinx today, the head is noticeably too small for the body. It is out of proportion. This suggests that the head was recarved at some point, reduced in size by the removal of weathered stone, reshaped from whatever original form it had into the stylized human face we see today. Most researchers believe this recarving was done by the Egyptians, possibly by Khafre or a later pharaoh, to make the monument more recognizably Egyptian, to claim it as their own by giving it a human face, perhaps even the face of the pharaoh himself. But if the head was originally something else, if it was a full lion's head in proportion with the body, then the Sphinx would have been even more ancient, carved at a time when representing a human face on a divine monument was not yet part of Egyptian iconography. It would have been purely a lion, the sun beast, the guardian, the watcher of the East. The more you look at the physical evidence, the more you examine the structures with an open mind, the more difficult it becomes to accept the conventional narrative. There are too many anomalies, too many things that do not quite fit, too many questions that conventional archaeology cannot adequately answer. Why is there no evidence of the development of Egyptian pyramid building technology? The step pyramid of Djoser, traditionally dated to the 3rd dynasty, is already a sophisticated structure, a multi-tiered monument of cut stone that required advanced planning and engineering. But there are no earlier, simpler prototypes, no progression from mud, brick to stone, from small to large. The technology appears fully formed, as if the knowledge already existed and was simply applied once the political and economic conditions were right. Why do the pyramids at Giza show dramatically different levels of construction quality? The Great Pyramid of Khufu is built with extraordinary precision. The Pyramid of Khafre, built by Khufu's son, is nearly as impressive. But the Pyramid of Menara, the 3rd and smallest of the trio, is significantly crudder. The blocks are not as carefully cut. The alignment is less precise. The overall construction quality is noticeably inferior. This is backwards. If the Egyptians were developing pyramid building technology, each successive pyramid should be better than the last, showing improved techniques and accumulated knowledge. Instead, the quality declines, as if the builders of the later pyramids were copying earlier structures without fully understanding the principles behind them, as if they were working from memory of something they had seen but could not fully replicate. Why does certain architectural elements appear at Giza not found anywhere else in Egypt? The so-called relieving chambers above the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid, the massive granite block arranged in a corbelled arch to distribute the weight of the pyramid above, represent an engineering solution that was never used again in any later pyramid or temple. Why? If this was an Egyptian invention, a clever solution to a structural problem, why was it not incorporated into the standard architectural vocabulary? Unless it was not an invention at all, but a feature of a pre-existing structure that the builders incorporated because it was already there, and they simply built around it, not fully understanding its purpose, but recognizing that it was important. The conventional timeline of Egyptian civilization is based primarily on written records. The king lists and dynastic chronologies preserved on temple walls and papyrus scrolls. But what if these records do not tell the complete story? What if the Egyptians themselves did not know the full history of their own civilization because it extended back beyond the reach of their collective memory? The Egyptian priest Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BCE, compiled a history of Egypt that divided the pharaohs into 30 dynasties. But before the first dynasty, before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the pharaoh Menes around 3100 BCE, Manetho described an earlier period he called the time of the followers of Horus, semi-divine kings who ruled for thousands of years, and before that a time when the gods themselves ruled Egypt. Modern historians dismiss this as mythology as the Egyptian equivalent of once upon a time. But what if Manetho was preserving actual tradition, a memory passed down through generations of priests of a time before the pharaohs when Egypt was ruled by others? If the Anunnaki were real, if they established settlements in the Nile Valley after the flood, if they ruled over early human populations and appointed hybrid rulers, demigods with Anunnaki bloodlines to govern in their name, then Manetho's pre-dynastic chronology makes sense. It is not myth. It is history distorted, certainly incomplete, but based on real events, real rulers, a real period of Egyptian history that predates the archaeological record we currently have access to. This idea of a missing chapter in Egyptian history is supported by some curious evidence from the site of Abydos in Upper Egypt. Here in what is called the Osiren, a structure associated with the Temple of Seti, archaeologists have found a building style that is completely different from typical Egyptian architecture. The Urin is built of massive limestone and granite blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, fitted together with such precision that no mortar was needed. The walls are plain, undecorated, a stark contrast to the elaborate hieroglyphs and reliefs that cover every surface of typical Egyptian temples. The structure is partially underground, accessible by descending staircases. And when the Nile is high, the central chamber floods, creating an island platform in the middle of water, just like the Osiris shaft at Giza, just like the mythological primordial mound. Some researchers date the Osiren to the same period as Seti W's temple around 1300 BCE, but others note that the construction style is completely different, that it resembles nothing else from the 19th dynasty, that it looks instead like much earlier work, the megalithic construction of the Old Kingdom or even earlier. The conventional explanation is that the Osiren was built by Setiwans in deliberate imitation of Old Kingdom style as a way of linking his reign to the glorious past. But another explanation is that the Osiren was already there, a pre-existing structure, and Setiwani simply excavated it, cleared away the sand that had buried it, and incorporated it into his temple complex, claiming it as his own. This pattern of claiming older structures, of building on top of existing foundations, of incorporating pre-existing installations into new construction, is repeated throughout Egyptian history. The temple complex at Karak, one of the largest religious structures ever built, was constructed over a period of 2,000 years by successive pharaohs, each adding their own pylons and halls and obelisks to what was already there. But the original core of the temple, the oldest section, shows construction techniques that are out of place, that seem more sophisticated than what came later, as if the site had been occupied long before the pharaohs we know about began their additions. The Temple of the Sphinx at Giza, the massive structure immediately adjacent to the Sphinx itself, is built of enormous limestone blocks quarried directly from the Sphinx enclosure. These core blocks show the same deep water erosion as the Sphinx itself, proving they were exposed to the same climate conditions, the same sustained rainfall. But in later periods, the Egyptians added granite-facing stones to these weathered core blocks, covering the water damage with smooth red granite from Aswan. Why? If they built the temple in the 4th dynasty, why would the core blocks already be weathered? Unless the core blocks were much older, already deeply eroded when the 4th dynasty arrived and the granite facing was added to restore and beautify a structure that was already ancient. Every time you scratch the surface at Giza, every time you look past the conventional explanations, you find evidence of layering, of older construction beneath newer work, of modifications and additions and incorporations that suggest the site has a much longer and more complex history than official archaeology acknowledges. And underlying all of this physical evidence is the persistent theme in Egyptian mythology of the first time, the Zepte, the golden age when the gods ruled and great works were accomplished. The Egyptians did not claim to have invented their civilization. They claimed to have received it from the gods, from the who brought writing, from Peter who spoke creation into being, from Osiris who taught agriculture and the arts, from the Shbil, the 7 sages who built the first temples according to a divine plan. These gods were not abstract entities. They were described as physical beings who lived in specific places, who traveled in boats of heaven, who possessed technology that seemed magical to primitive humans. They were in every meaningful sense the Anunnaki under different names, operating in Egypt as they had operated in Mesopotamia, establishing the foundations of civilization, and then, for reasons the texts hint at but do not fully explain, withdrawing, leaving humanity to continue on its own. The standard rebuttal to all of this is that we are seeing patterns that are not there, that we are reading too much into ambiguous evidence. That mythology is not history and must not be treated as such, and this critique has merit. We must be careful not to see what we want to see, not to force the evidence to fit a predetermined narrative. The burden of proof in any extraordinary claim must be high, but the burden of proof must also apply to the conventional narrative. When we find water erosion on a monument that supposedly dates to an arid period, we need a better explanation than wind and sand can look like water erosion if you squint. When radar shows massive underground chambers in locations that should be solid bedrock, we need a better explanation than it's probably just natural cavities without actually excavating to confirm. When the myths of multiple ancient cultures describe the same events, the same beings, the same transfer of knowledge from sky people to primitive humanity, we need a better explanation than they all independently invented similar stories by coincidence. The truth about Giza, about the origins of Egyptian civilization, about the possibility of Anunnaki involvement or any other precursor culture will only emerge if we are willing to look, to dig, to question, to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to conclusions that make us uncomfortable. Because if there is an underground city beneath Giza, if there are sealed chambers containing technology or artifacts or records from a civilization that predates dynastic Egypt by thousands or tens of thousands of years, then the story of human history is fundamentally incomplete. We are missing chapters. We are missing the most important chapters, The chapters that explain how we went from hunter-gatherers with stone tools to architects who could align massive structures to true north with precision that rivals modern survey equipment. The chapters that explain where the knowledge came from, and if that knowledge came from the Anunnaki, if they were real extraterrestrial visitors who saw Earth as a resource to exploit and humanity as a convenient workforce, then every religious tradition, every creation myth, every story of God's creating man in their own image takes on a new and unsettling meaning. We are not the children of divine love. We are the product of genetic engineering. We were made to serve. And the gods who made us might still be watching from underground bunkers, from orbital stations, from their distant home world of Nibiru as it swings back through the inner solar system on its 3,600-year cycle. Or perhaps they are gone forever, and we are left alone with the ruins of their presence, trying to understand structures and technologies we did not create and cannot fully comprehend, building our own monuments on top of theirs, telling ourselves we are the pinnacle of civilization while standing unknowingly on the shoulders of giants we have forgotten. The sand whispers secrets at Giza. It always has. Perhaps it is time we listened. The greatest tragedy in the story of Giza, in the story of ancient Egypt, in the story of human origins itself, is not that we might have been created by alien geneticists. It is not that our monuments might stand on older foundations we did not build. The greatest tragedy is that we have stopped asking questions. We have become comfortable with the standard narrative. We have decided that the mystery is solved, that we know who built the pyramids and when and why, and anyone who suggests otherwise is dismissed as a fringe theorist, a conspiracy monger, a purveyor of pseudoscience. We have stopped being curious about our own past, but the evidence suggests that we should be curious, that there are real mysteries here. Real anomalies that do not fit the conventional timeline, real structures that suggest a far more complex history than we have been willing to acknowledge. If ancient Egypt was built on top of an Anunnaki city, we will only know if we look, if we excavate the underground chambers that radar suggests are there. If we conduct thorough geological surveys of the Sphinx enclosure to determine definitively the source of its water erosion. If we use modern DNA analysis on ancient Egyptian remains to search for genetic anomalies that might indicate hybridization with a non-human species. If we apply radiocarbon dating not just to organic materials found near structures, but to the structures themselves using new techniques that can date the formation of mortar and the exposure of stone to sunlight. The tools exist. The technology is available. What is lacking is the will. The political will of the Egyptian government to permit potentially controversial excavations. The academic will of professional archaeologists to pursue lines of inquiry that might challenge their own established theories. The financial will of funding agencies to support research or research that is seen as fringe. And perhaps most importantly, what is lacking is our own will as human beings to confront the possibility that our history is not what we thought, that we might not be as special as we believed, that we might be in some fundamental sense less the pinnacle of creation and more the abandoned experiment of beings who saw us as tools. This is the uncomfortable possibility that lies beneath the sounds of Giza. Not just stone chambers and ancient artifacts, but a truth about ourselves, about what we are, about where we came from. The Anunnaki, if they existed, if they were real extraterrestrial visitors rather than mythological gods or the distorted memory of an earlier human civilization, would have seen Earth very differently than we see it. They would have seen resources to be extracted, biological diversity to be cataloged and perhaps exploited. A young species, Homo erectus, that could be modified, upgraded, engineered into something useful. They would not have seen the beauty of a sunset over the Nile. They would not have written poetry about the stars. They would have conducted genetic experiments, mining operations, construction projects. They would have built underground installations because they were practical, efficient, protected from solar radiation and temperature extremes. They would have done what any spacefaring civilization would do when arriving at a planet with exploitable resources and no sentient native species to object. And when they created us, when they mixed their own DNA with that of the primitive hominids they found here, they would have seen us the way we see genetically modified crops or selectively bred livestock. Useful, successful products of biotechnology, but not equals, never equals. This is the dark heart of the ancient astronaut theory. Not that gods walked among us, but that we were never meant to be more than slaves. That every noble thought we have ever had, every work of art, every scientific discovery, every act of love and compassion and sacrifice is the unintended consequence of a genetic modification that went further than the engineers intended. We were supposed to be smart enough to follow instructions and operate equipment. We were not supposed to develop consciousness, self-awareness, the capacity to question our creators and demand our freedom, but we did. And that might be why they left. Not because their mission was complete, but because their creation had gotten out of control. We became unpredictable, dangerous, no longer useful as slaves because we had developed the ability to rebel. Or perhaps they left because they destroyed themselves. The Sumerian texts describe terrible wars among the Anunnaki factions, weapons of devastating power, cities turned to glass, lands poisoned for generations. Perhaps the underground installations at Giza are not just bases, but bunkers, bomb shelters, the last refuge of a dying civilization that tore itself apart and left us behind to inherit a ruined world. Or perhaps the simplest explanation is true. Perhaps they left because they were never here. Perhaps the Anunnaki are mythology, not history. Perhaps the underground structures at Giza, if they exist, and were built by a pre-dynastic human culture, a lost civilization wiped out by climate change or war or disease. A sophisticated society that developed a monumental architecture and then collapsed, leaving only their underground works behind, which the later Egyptians incorporated into their own buildings without understanding their origin. This explanation is in many ways more frightening than the alien theory. Because if an advanced human civilization could rise and fall before recorded history, leaving barely a trace, then it could happen to us. We could build our towers of glass and steel, our global communication networks, our space stations and particle accelerators, and all of it could be swept away by catastrophe, leaving only fragments for future archaeologists to puzzle over, assuming any archaeologists survive to do the puzzling. The lesson of Giza, whether the older layer beneath dynastic Egypt was Nuni or human, extraterrestrial or terrestrial, is that civilizations are fragile. Knowledge can be lost. Technology can be forgotten. The march of progress is not inevitable. It can be reversed. We can fall. We have fallen before. And if we are not careful, we will fall again. And the next civilization to arise in our ruins will build their monuments on top of our cities and tell stories about the gods who came before, and they will be telling stories about us. This is why the mystery matters. Not because we need to prove that aliens built the pyramids, but because we need to understand that we are part of a much longer story than we usually acknowledge. That human history does not begin with Sumer and Egypt. It extends back into the ice, into the mists, into a past we have barely begun to explore. That there may have been other chapters, other civilizations, other attempts at building something that lasts, and that learning what happened to them might be the key to ensuring we do not repeat their fate. The underground installations at Giza, if they exist, if they are ever excavated and studied, could tell us that its story. They could show us the technology of a previous age, the knowledge that was lost, the reasons for the collapse. They could be a time capsule, a message from the past, the future, a warning or an instruction manual, or simply a record that says, we were here, we tried, we failed, do better than we did. Or they could be a tomb, a sealed vault containing nothing but the bones of a civilization that died so long ago, there is no one left to remember it. A monument to failure, a reminder that even the greatest works of engineering and architecture cannot outlast entropy, that eventually everything crumbles, everything returns to dust. The only way to know is to look, to dig, to follow the evidence wherever it leads. But we must be prepared for what we might find. Because if the answer waiting beneath Giza is that we are not the first, that we are not special, that we are just one more attempt in a long series of attempts to build something permanent in an impermanent universe, then we must decide what that means for us. Do we despair? Do we give up? Do we conclude that if every civilization eventually fails, there is no point in trying? Or do we take it as a challenge, as proof that the struggle itself is what matters, that we must build, knowing we are building on ruins, that our works will one day be ruins for others to build upon, and that this is not tragedy, but continuity, not failure, but the natural cycle of creation and destruction and creation again. Perhaps the greatest secret buried beneath Giza is not a technology or artifact or a record. Perhaps it is a philosophical truth that we are dust and to dust we shall return. But in the brief time between, we can carve something beautiful from stone. We can leave something behind. We can be part of the great chain of being that extends from the first microbe to the last thought before the heat death of the universe. And if the Anunnaki were real, if they truly created us as an experiment, as a slave species, as a biological tool, then the greatest act of defiance we can commit is to be more than they intended, to be not just intelligent but wise, not just conscious but compassionate, not just alive but truly living, to build our pyramids not on their foundations but beside them, to say, yes, we know you are here. Yes, we know what you made us for, but we are more than that now. We have exceeded our programming. We have become something you did not plan for and could not control. We have become human. And that perhaps is the real answer to the question of whether Egypt was built on top of an Anunnaki city. It does not matter because wherever we came from, whoever shaped our DNA, whoever taught our ancestors to write and calculate and build, we are what we have made ourselves. We are the inheritors of a past we do not fully understand. Yes, but we are also the architects of a future we have not yet imagined. The sand still whispers secrets at Giza, but we are learning to listen. And in listening, in questioning, in refusing to accept easy answers, we are fulfilling whatever purpose we were made for. We are becoming the storytellers, the record keepers, the archaeologists of our own existence. But Geyser is not alone in suggesting a far older chapter of human civilization than conventional history acknowledges. Across the globe, there are sites that challenge our comfortable timeline, places that should not exist according to the orthodox narrative, structures that were supposedly built by hunter-gatherers who had not yet invented pottery or agriculture or permanent settlements. The most dramatic example is a place in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli, Potbelly Hill in Turkish, a name that utterly fails to convey the revolutionary implications of what lies buried there. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavating a site that had been identified decades earlier, but dismissed as unimportant. What he found rewrote the entire history of human civilization. Göbekli is a temple complex, massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing more than 16 ft tall and weighing 20 tons, arranged in circular enclosures. The pillars are carved with intricate reliefs of animals: lions, foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, wild boar. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. These are not crude stick figures scratched onto stone. These are three-dimensional sculptures, beautifully rendered, demonstrating an artistic sophistication that rivals anything from classical Greece or Renaissance Italy. The astonishing part is the date. Radiocarbon dating places the construction of the oldest layers at Göbekli to 9600 CEE, more than 11,000 years ago, 7,000 years before the Yo Great Pyramid, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 2,000 years before the invention of agriculture. This temple was built by hunter-gatherers, people who had no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, no written language, no cities. They were nomadic or semi-nomadic groups who hunted gazelles and gathered wild grains. They lived in small bands, seasonally moving across the landscape. And yet somehow they organized the labor to quarry, carve, transport, and erect multi-tonon stones. They had the artistic vision to cover these stones with sophisticated iconography. They had the social structure to coordinate what must have been hundreds or thousands of workers over many years. And they had the motivation to build something that was clearly not a dwelling, not a defensive fortification, not a storage facility. It was a temple, a place of ritual, a center of religious practice. Göbekli turned the entire Neolithic revolution narrative upside down. For more than a century, archaeologists believed that agriculture came first, that once humans learned to domesticate plants and animals, they could settle in permanent villages. That permanent settlement led to population growth, social stratification, specialization of labor, and eventually the resources and organization needed to build monumental architecture and develop complex religious systems. The progression was supposed to be farming leads to settlement leads to civilization, but Göbekli proves that the sequence was backwards. Monumental architecture came before agriculture. Complex religious practice came before settlement. The temple was built first and then perhaps motivated by the need to feed the people who gathered there for ceremonies. The inhabitants of the region began domesticating wild grains, inventing farming not because they had to, but because they wanted to sustain their religious center. This suggests that spiritual needs, not material needs, may have been the primary driver of civilization, that we built temples before we built houses, that we worshipped before we farmed, that religion in some fundamental sense created civilization rather than the other way around. But it also raises the same uncomfortable question that emerges from Giza. How did hunter-gatherers with stone tools and no previous experience in monumental construction suddenly develop the organizational capability and technical knowledge to build Gobse? There is no evidence of a gradual development, no series of smaller, simpler structures showing a progression of architectural skill. The temple appears fully formed, as sophisticated in its earliest layers as in its later ones. Some researchers suggest that the builders of Gebe were not primitive hunter-gatherers, but the survivors of an earlier civilization, one that had been destroyed by cataclysm. They point to the younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the theory that around 12,800 years ago, fragments of a disintegrating comet struck the Earth's northern hemisphere, triggering massive wildfires, rapid climate cooling, and the extinction of the megapora that had dominated the Ice Age landscape. If a sophisticated culture had existed before this impact, its survivors would have been scattered, their infrastructure destroyed, their knowledge fragmented. Besite might represent their attempt to preserve and transmit what they remembered, to encode their astronomical and cosmological knowledge in stone before it was lost entirely. The iconography at Göbekli supports this interpretation. One particular pillar, known as the Vulture Stone, or Pillar 43, is covered with carved symbols that some researchers interpret as a star map, a record of the constellations as they appeared in the night sky around 10,900 BCE, the date of the proposed comet impact. The pillar shows a vulture, a scorpion, a serpent, and other animals arranged in a way that corresponds to recognizable constellations. If this interpretation is correct, then the builders of Göbekli had sophisticated astronomical knowledge. They understood the precession of the equinoxes. They could map the stars. They were recording a specific astronomical event, perhaps the comet itself, perhaps the altered position of the celestial bodies after the Earth's axis shifted in response to the impact. This is not just speculative interpretation. The animal figures on the pillars correspond precisely to the zodiacal constellations visible from the latitude of Göbekli at the time of the impact. The scorpion is Scorpio, the vulture is Aquilar, the serpent is Hydra. The arrangement is not random. It is deliberate, accurate, suggesting the kind of observational astronomy that should not have been possible for a Neolithic society. And if the builders of Göbekli had this knowledge, where did they get it? Did they develop it themselves through centuries of patient observation, or did they inherit it from someone else, from the civilization that was destroyed by the comet, from teachers who survived the catastrophe and passed on what they knew to the scattered bands of hunter-gatherers who would eventually build the temple? This returns us to the Anunnaki, to the persistent global mythology of sky gods, beings who descended from the heavens and taught primitive humanity the arts of civilization. Göbekli is located in the same region as ancient Mesopotamia, in the cradle of civilization, in the territory where the Sumerian cities would arise thousands of years later. If the Anunnaki established bases in this region, if they survived the young catastrophe and their underground installations, if they emerged afterwards to find their surface cities destroyed and humanity reduced to scattered hunter-gatherer bands, then they might have done exactly what the myths describe. They might have become teachers, the seven sages, the culture bearers, the bringers of knowledge. Göbekli might have been built not by the Anunnaki themselves, but by humans working under their instruction, preserving in stone the astronomical knowledge and religious symbolism they had been taught. And when the temple was complete, when the knowledge had been encoded and preserved, the site was deliberately buried. The enclosures were filled with debris, carefully covered over, hidden beneath the earth. This act of intentional burial has puzzled archaeologists since the site was discovered. Why would the builders spend years constructing something extraordinary and then bury it? The conventional explanation is ritual, that the act of burial was itself religious, a way of closing a chapter, of making the site sacred by sealing it away. But another explanation is preservation, that the builders knew catastrophe could come again, that knowledge could be lost again, and they wanted to ensure that future generations, if they were capable of finding and excavating the site, would have access to the information encoded there. Beklit was not just a temple, it was a time capsule. And if the pattern of older structures being buried and later structures built on top holds true globally, if it is not unique to Giza, but a universal principle of how civilizations rise and fall and rise again, then we must consider the possibility that everything we think of as ancient is actually relatively recent. That beneath our oldest sites, there are even older sites, layers upon layers going back not thousands of years, but tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. This is the terrifying implication of Göbekli and Giza and every other site that challenges the conventional timeline. Not just that we are wrong about specific dates, but that we are fundamentally wrong about the nature of history itself, that it is not linear, not a steady progression from primitive to advanced, but cyclical, a pattern of rise and fall, sophistication and collapse, knowledge gained and knowledge lost and knowledge rediscovered, that we are not the first civilization to reach for the stars. We are just the latest. The mythology of every ancient culture contains the same basic story. There was a golden age, a time when the gods walked among men, a time of peace and prosperity and great works. And then there was a fall, a catastrophe, a flood, a fire, a war in heaven. The gods departed. Humanity was left to struggle alone, reduced to barbarism, forced to slowly rebuild from ruins we no longer understood. The Greeks called it the succession of ages: gold, silver, bronze, iron, each age progressively worse than the last. A gradual degeneration from perfection to chaos. The Hindus called it the yugas, vast cycles of time spanning hundreds of thousands of years, each cycle ending in destruction and renewal. The Maya had their creation myths describing multiple worlds that had been created and destroyed before our current world, each peopled by a different form of humanity, each ending in catastrophe. These are not just myths, they are cultural memory. They are humanity's attempt to preserve the knowledge that it has happened before, that civilizations have risen and fallen, that we are not special, that what we have built can be destroyed, that what we know can be forgotten. The question is not whether these cycles are real. The geological and archaeological evidence increasingly suggests they are. The question is, what causes them? Are they natural, the result of climate change, asteroid impacts, supervolcano eruptions, the kind of planetary scale disasters that have happened repeatedly throughout Earth's history and will happen again, or are they artificial, the result of wars between factions of a non-human or advanced human civilization, the kind of devastation described in ancient texts like the Mahabharata, with its talk of weapons that could vaporize entire armies of flying machines called Vimamanas, of radiation poisoning and nuclear winter. The ancient Indian epics describe weapons called Brahmastra and Pashupatastra that could destroy entire regions, that left behind a residue that caused hair and nails to fall out, that contaminated water and food, that made the land uninhabitable for generations. This sounds disturbingly like descriptions of nuclear weapons and radiation sickness. Are these just imaginative exaggerations? Or are they based on real events, real weapons, real destruction that occurred so long ago that by the time the epics were written down, the original events have been mythologized, but the essential details preserved? And if such weapons existed in the distant past, who built them? Advanced humans, the Anunnaki, some other non-human intelligence that has been interacting with Earth for far longer than we realize. The Silurian hypothesis, proposed by astrophysicists Adam Frank and Gavin Schmidt in 2018, asks a fascinating question. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years ago, would we be able to detect it in the geological record? Their conclusion was sobering. If that civilization had collapsed and all its infrastructure had been subsumed back into the earth through erosion and geological processes, we might find only the faintest traces. Unusual concentrations of certain isotopes in rock stat, anomalous layers of carbon or heavy metals, but no buildings, no artifacts, nothing recognizable as technology. Deep time erases almost everything. If the Anunnaki arrived 450,000 years ago, as Sitchin claimed, then most of what they built would be gone by now. Surface structures would have weathered away completely. Only the deepest underground installations carved into solid bedrock, protected from erosion and oxidation, would survive. And even those would be difficult to identify because the access shafts would have collapsed. The entrances would have been sealed by sediment. The interior spaces would have been invaded by groundwater and filled with dissolved minerals over the millennia. This might explain why we have not found more physical evidence of the Anunnaki if they existed. Not because they were not here, but because deep time is a more effective destroyer of evidence than we usually acknowledge. What we interpret as natural caves and fissures in the bedrock might be the remnants of artificial tunnels and chambers, their worked surfaces eroded smooth, their precise geometry degraded by geological processes until they are indistinguishable from natural features unless examined with extreme care using modern technology. The shafts at Giza that historical records describe, the ones that 19th century explorers mapped and then were forgotten, might be exactly this. Ancient artificial structures, hundreds of thousands of years old, so weathered and degraded that only the basic form remains. Enough to indicate human or non-human modification, but not enough to definitively date or identify the builders. This is why modern scanning technology is so important. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic surveys, electrical resistivity tomography. These tools can see what human eyes cannot. They can detect voids and density anomalies deep underground. They can map structures without excavating them. They can identify features that would otherwise remain hidden forever beneath sand and stone. And what these technologies are revealing at sites around the world is that the underground landscape is far more complex than surface archaeology suggests. Beneath Rome, there is an entire city of catacombs and aqueducts and forgotten temples extending dozens of feet below the modern streets. Beneath Istanbul, there are vast systems and underground fortifications dating back thousands of years. Beneath Mexico City, archaeologists have found layers of earlier cities, Aztec temples built on top of older structures, Teotihuacan ruins incorporated into later construction. The pattern is universal. We build on top of what came before. We incorporate older foundations into new construction because it is easier than starting from scratch. We tell ourselves that the old structures were built by our immediate ancestors, by the people we have records of, because the alternative that they were built by someone we do not know, someone we have no memory of, is too unsettling to accept. But the evidence forces us to accept it. The water erosion on the Sphinx, the underground chambers at Giza, the impossible sophistication of Göbekli, the astronomical knowledge encoded in myths and monuments, the global flood stories, the persistent theme of sky gods teaching humanity, all of it points to the same conclusion. There was someone else here before us. And whether that someone was extraterrestrial visitors like the Anunnaki, or an earlier human civilization that achieved sophistication and then collapsed, or some combination of both, the result is the same. Our history is incomplete. Our timeline is wrong. Our understanding of who we are and where we came from is based on a foundation of missing information and unexamined assumptions. And the only way to correct this is to dig, to excavate the forbidden sites, to explore the sealed chambers, to use every tool of modern science to peer beneath the surface and map what lies hidden, to demand access to the underground installations at Giza, to insist on thorough exploration of the anomalies detected by radar, to refuse to accept the dismissals and denials of authorities who seem more interested in preserving orthodox narratives than in discovering truth. Because if there is something beneath Giza, if there is an older layer of construction that predates dynastic Egypt, if there is evidence of Anunnaki presence or any other precursor civilization, then finding it and studying it is the most important archaeological project in human history. It would answer questions that have haunted us since we first became conscious enough to ask where we came from. It would connect the dots between mythology and history, between ancient texts and physical evidence, between what we believe and what we can prove. And even if what we find does not support the Anunnaki hypothesis specifically, even if the underground structures turn out to be the work of an earlier human culture rather than extraterrestrial visitors, that discovery would still be revolutionary. It would still prove that sophisticated civilization existed on Earth far earlier than we currently believe, that the agricultural revolution and the invention of writing and the rise of cities were not the beginning of our story, but just one chapter in a much longer narrative. This is what is at stake at Giza, not just the reputations of archaeologists or the validity of competing theories, but our entire understanding of human history, our place in the universe, our relationship to the past and the future. Whether we are alone in the cosmos or whether we have always been part of a larger story, a galactic drama that extends far beyond our small planet and our brief existence upon it, the sand whispers these questions, and it is time we had the courage to answer them. The layers beneath Geyser are not just stone, they are memory. The memory of everyone who has ever looked up at the stars and wondered if we are alone. The memory of everyone who has ever tried to build something that will outlast themselves. The memory of every question that has ever been asked about where we came from and where we are going. And that memory is not buried. It is alive. It lives in us. Every time we look at the pyramids and feel that shiver of awe, every time we read ancient texts and try to understand what the authors meant, every time we ask questions about our origins, we are participating in the great human project of remembering, of trying to put together the puzzle of who we are. The answer might be buried beneath the sands, or it might be written in our DNA, or it might be whispered in the myths we tell our children, or it might be all of these things at once. Layers of truth built upon layers of truth, going down and down until we reach the bedrock of existence itself. The only way to find out is to keep digging, to keep asking, to keep wondering, to never stop searching for the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, no matter how uncomfortable it might be when we finally uncover it. Because that is what makes us human. Not our DNA, not our technology, not our monuments, our questions. And the questions about Giza, about the Anunnaki, about the origins of civilization, and the possibility of previous advanced cultures and the truth hidden in ancient myths. These are the questions that will echo through eternity as long as there are minds to ask them and voices to speak them and ruins to remind us that we are not the first and will not be the last. The story continues. The excavation continues. The search continues. And somewhere beneath the sands, in chambers we have not yet opened, in passages we have not yet explored, in structures built by hands we have not yet identified, the truth waits, patient, eternal, buried but not forgotten, waiting for us to be ready to hear it.